On this episode of In the Gun, we've waited, we've anticipated. It's finally Penn State week. It's finally time for some Mountaineer football. We're going to preview those Nittany Lions and everything to expect when big noon kickoff comes rolling to town here on Labor Day weekend. All that and more on this edition of In the Gun.
You are now watching Believe.
ITG.
With Wes, Owen, and Jed.
I've got the best teammates in the business here, all right?
No way!
Oh, they both played the game. They both know the game. Owen is the runaway beer truck known for having some fun.
Owen Schmidt, like a runaway beer truck down the sidelines.
Jed is the signal caller who is the X's and O's and the brainiac.
First of all, Jed's research is pretty impressive.
So we've combined those two skill sets.
Skills I've acquired over a very long career.
You are In the Gun.
Once you enter this family, there's no getting out.
In the Gun, episode 182 of your new favorite WVU football podcast. I'm Wesley Euler. It's time for the PSU preview here on episode 182, and I got the best teammates in the business rocking and rolling with us here today. We've got the signal caller, Jed Drenning. We've got the producer slash co-host slash Mr. Do-It-All extraordinaire, Skylar Callahan. We may or may not be joined by the beer truck. It'll be like a little mystery bag as the rest of the show rolls along here. Owen dealing with some football practice down there with Greenbrier West, getting those boys ready. So we'll see if he's got time to pop in before we get out of here. We will have a special guest, Cody Alexander, for you a little bit later. But before we get to any and all of that, we always know this episode of ITG brought to you in part by our friends at BetOnline, the world's most trusted betting platform and your number one source for everything football. From the NFL to college kickoff, BetOnline has every stat, every matchup, and even live odds and spreads while the games are being played. So you think you know your stuff? Get in on a winner-take-all $300,000 NFL survivor pool for the upcoming season. And when the games are over, you can head to their online casino, get in on a game of blackjack or poker, or unwind with one of over 150 slot games. So head to the website today and use the promo code BELIEVE when you sign up to get in on the action. That's BLEAV at BetOnline. The game starts here. And boys, the games are finally starting. Yes, I know we had week 0 and that dramatic game between Georgia Tech and Florida State. Georgia, the only Tech that matters. Big shout out to the Yellow Jackets there for getting it done in Dublin. But this is the real thing, right? This is the full slate, the full gambit. Week 1. We've waited. We've anticipated. It is finally Penn State week. It is finally time for some college football in full effect. I'm jacked up. I'm excited. I'm ready to go.
Yeah, it feels like we were just doing the bowl game here in my backyard not too long ago, and all of a sudden, blink of an eye, here we go.
Skylar, week 0 is kind of you go to the food court and the guy or the gal sitting outside the Chinese restaurant has the little samplers on the toothpick. That's week 0, right? But now we're going on
Costco on Sunday.
Whole entree.
We're getting the whole entree now. It's the whole entree. It's not the little thing on the toothpick. Because I'll sit there and nibble on 2 or 3 of those things, me and my boy. But yeah, it's the full Monty. We're in. It is officially game week. I couldn't be more excited. We've been, as you touched on, Skylar, waiting since shortly after Christmas to do this all over again. We finished on a high note, which left you just kind of wanting more. You didn't want that season to end last year. And here we are with one of the biggest brands in all of sports rolling into town. And we're going to take their best shot. They're going to take our best shot. Here we go.
And with that, guys, listen, there's always a lot of hype. There's always a lot of build up around, the opening of a new season, a new college football season. But particularly for this game, it's the big noon kickoff. It's WVU and Penn State, 2 old historic rivals who are, renewing this thing for the first time in 30 some years, right? First time since 1992 that the Nittany Lions have come to Morgantown. 2 big fan bases, 2 passionate football crazy fan bases with notable alumni that work in the media and around the sports world as well too. And of course, at the forefront of that for WVU is of course one Pat McAfee, who will be doing his show, by the way, from the Life Sciences building there, right where old Mountaineer Field used to be Friday at noon. So if you're going to be on campus or if you're a student, got to make sure you're checking that out. I'm jealous of that one. But, in all of this build up, a little back and forth, Jed, from Pat McAfee and James Franklin here. I mean, this is what happens when you, again, typically big games, rivalries, all of this, they have build up, but especially when it's the opening week of the season and you've kind of got an open-ended timeline here to start things. So how about James Franklin talking about Pat McAfee a little bit today in his press conference?
Yeah, and James Franklin graduated from East Stroudsburg University. I think he had a major in coy after listening to that interview because he was being very coy with how he played that. It was almost somewhat deceptive. He let in like this backhanded compliment. Hey, I'm a big Pat McAfee fan. He's great for the sport. He's great for the game. And oh, by the way, sometimes as transparent and open and unique as he is, it might even motivate certain people, as this to suggest that the Penn State locker room on some level was motivated by the clowning around that McAfee's been doing the last couple of weeks about this opener. Maybe, again, no more motivated or less motivated than somebody scoring a touchdown with 5 seconds left to make sure they cover in Vegas like Penn State did last year. So there's plenty to go around in this one. Who cares either way? At the end of the day, Penn State's rolling into town for the first time in 32 years. I certainly don't believe West Virginia needs any extra incentive to be motivated. Maybe Penn State does. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think this whole thing kind of gets blown out of water about the whole late touchdown thing, and I get it. Like when it happened, I'm sure the whole team was pissed. Neil Brown was probably pissed, but even in the post game, he was asked about it last year, and he's like, "Is what it is. We didn't stop him." But with that being said, you can't tell me that that's still not somewhere in the back of his mind somewhere when the game comes around on Saturday and maybe this situation arises and the tables are turned, and maybe that interesting setup will kind of make for some interesting outcomes because I'd be really interested to see what happens if West Virginia. I know he wouldn't do it.
That's just it. The perfect ending to this,
right?
And this will be perfect for Neil. I'm sure if he's dreamt about some sort of result in this game, first any form of winning he would take. But if you're up by 2 touchdowns or 17 points on Penn State at the 3-yard line with 6 seconds left, I bet my life 6 times over he takes a knee and then says, "See, that's what we're about. Thanks for showing us what you're about."
See you in 2058.
But I would love to be in position to find out.
This is the portion of the preseason build-up timeline that drives me nuts where I'm ready for just the ball to be kicked in the air. If James Franklin is walking around the Penn State facility going, "See, guys, you see Pat McAfee's talking about how WVU is going to beat you," Penn State ain't going to do butt kiss this year. They're not going to win the Big Ten. They're not going to make the playoff. If they need to get motivated by goofy-ass Pat McAfee, 37 Guinness deep talking about WVU, they shouldn't be playing Division I football, certainly not in the Big Ten. If Eddie V and the WVU defensive line needs to sit there and watch that touchdown on the last play of the game last year on repeat for 37 hours to get psyched out, they're going to lose to Penn State. All this motivational crap. Listen, there's exceptions to this rule, okay? We've all seen the Bill Stewart speech before the Fiesta Bowl. The Mountaineers could have played the 85 Bears after that, and they would have won the game, right? Okay, so motivation is a real thing. But you know what meant more on that day than Bill Stewart's all-time incredible speech? Was having guys like Pat White and Steve Slayton and Noel Devine and Owen Schmidt and Eric Wicks and Reed Williams, right? That's why you beat Oklahoma that day. Now, we love the great motivational speech from Stu, but those things are so overrated. This isn't middle school football. You don't need a rah-rah speech to go out there and play. These guys now are, for all intents and purposes, as close to professionals as we've ever seen. That line has been blurred now more than ever. Some guys in college football are making more money than rookies in the NFL. Make no mistake about that. If you need some clip from ESPN to get yourself going, you ain't going to last very long. There, sorry, I'm off my soapbox. I'm done.
I would add
this. Kick the ball off on Saturday, for the love of God.
I'm convinced part of why we beat Oklahoma in the Fiesta Bowl was they spent 3 weeks hearing we couldn't. So, look, for the balance of 60 minutes, what happens between the lines, motivation doesn't matter there. That's when things kick in, you play the game. Motivation matters 8, 9, 10 days out for 18 to 22-year-olds to remain more focused than ever in a boring practice setting. When you're supremely motivated 2 weeks before a game starts and you walk into a meeting taking more notes than you've ever taken in a meeting that otherwise might be incredibly boring, that's where motivation comes in. Motivation doesn't come in once the ball's teed up. It's over then. That's just playing football. But just take the Oklahoma Fiesta Bowl game, the same thing. We heard from the time the regular season ended, we had no chance. And every member of that team, I promise you, every practice they had, they were more dialed in than they ordinarily would be as a 20-year-old with a million things on their mind. Same thing with this. I mean, he's trying to find ways to get him more dialed.
Too bad they weren't like that before the backyard brawl.
In other words, he's trying to find Penn State to give more reason to be dialed in blitz period on August 14th on the grease board.
No, listen,
West Virginia's trying to find
you're saying.
In the middle of July. You see what I'm saying? That's where the only place it matters.
Coaches push the buttons for a reason. I'm not naive, but again, if you're Penn State and you need Pat McAfee to get you motivated to go play an opener, you're not the 8th best team in the country. You're just not. Like,
and even the speeches in the locker room.
To me, we make so much out of that stuff.
By the time you put your preparation to bed, the game's decided. Okay. The game's decided.
Right.
There's no pregame locker room speech. There's no halftime speech. It's the game is played for the balance of 60 minutes between the lines. Who was more dialed in during the 2 or 3 boring weeks of preparation because they were motivated then? That's where these little tiny things might matter to get your backup tackle a little more dialed in for a certain blitz look than he otherwise would be on August 12th. You know what I'm saying? That's maybe he's a McAfee fan and he liked hearing that and it torqued him off. I have no idea, but it has nothing to do with game day, or I would even say the handful of days leading up to the game. It's all over by then. Preparation is when these games are decided.
The best piece of advice I ever got was when I was probably like 10 years old, and I just kept eating myself up about this really bad game I had. Was going back and watching it, going back and watching it, going back and watching it. My coach is like, look, watching film is good, but you can only win the game that's in front of you. So if going back and trying to find motivation off of something you did bad or something that you did wrong in a game or that you could have done better, like you can only go to a certain extent with that. Obviously, you want to learn from your mistakes. And obviously, in that game last year, there was a lot of plays in the third quarter. Neil's talked about it, where that situation would have been a lot different in the fourth quarter. They would have had to try and go score. It wouldn't have been the narrative that it is right now. So, only talk about the game in front of you because that's the only one that is really the next important game. You can't worry about last year.
I'll close with this, Skyler. My junior year in high school, we lost with 3 seconds left on a field goal in the state championship game. Somebody had a Polaroid of the scoreboard at Laidley Field. Back then it was a Polaroid. I took that and hung it over my bed in December before Christmas. It hung over my bed from December until the following September. And I looked and stared at it every day in my preparation for 9 months for what was going to get started in September. I didn't look at it that day of the game in September. I looked at it every day for the 9 months leading up to that day. That's when the motivation kicks in. That's when the motivation matters, if there is any.
Pittsburgh Penguins captain and one of the best hockey players of all time, Sidney Crosby, lives in Nova Scotia, Canada. In his gym there, he has a picture of every Stanley Cup champion lifting the cup from the year that he came into the league through this year. So he's on there 3 times, but it's from the year since he was 18 years old to 36. He's entering his 19th. Every person who's won the cup. That's a top 10 hockey player of all time. He's won it 3 times in his 18 years, okay? So motivation is one thing, but if it was the end-all be-all, Sidney Crosby would have 18 Stanley Cups because nobody's working harder than more motivated than that dude does. But again, there's a middle ground between how annoyed I am with all of this by now and what Jed and Skylar are saying, that there is certainly some merit to it. But the buildup is fun, but when we reach this point, I'm like, all right, let's just kick off. We're gonna be arguing about the creamery, the Penn State creamery against pepperoni rolls here, by Wednesday or something. Like let's just
to manufacture disrespect.
Exactly
they
right.
Really do. They have to bend over backwards to manufacture disrespect.
Jed, they have to go look at that guy up on TV drinking 37 Guinnesses saying WVU is going to beat you. Oh my goodness, how dare he? Wait, where did he go to school? WVU?
Kicker, yeah.
Oh, how dare he say that?
Yeah.
Big thanks to
Absolutely.
our friends at Toothman Ford and our guy JR for being a presenting sponsor of this In the Gun podcast. We all know cars cost less in Grafton. Big thanks to all of our friends there at Team Toothman. All right, Jed, speaking of team, it is time to get into some team discussion here. And let's start with the Penn State offense against the WVU defense. Set the table for us. Where does this all begin?
I do want to, encourage people. Please stick around when we, after the break, preview the defense, because we're bringing Cody Alexander in, and he's looking at what Tom Allen did at Indiana and giving you a pretty good guess as to what we can expect Tom Allen to do at Penn State. It's a very thorough vetting of the Tom Allen defense. You're going to want to hear that. But on the offensive side with Penn State, very interesting transition season. 3 new coordinators, offense, defense, special teams. All 3 phases have new coordinators for Penn State. And why it's interesting on the offensive side of the football, you're talking about a Penn State team, guys, that offensively last year led the Big Ten in scoring at 36 points a game for the first time since 2008. They led the Big Ten in rushing for the first time since 2002 when Larry Johnson was playing before he got drafted by the Chiefs. The last 2 years, they've led the Big Ten in red zone touchdown percentage. We always talk about what a critical piece that is statistically. There's 75+% touchdowns in the red zone. And yet the guy who organized and orchestrated all this got fired. Why? Because there are certain games that are get over the hump games that Penn State, as a program at large with James Franklin, has consistently found a way to lose. Typically, just like last year, it's the Ohio State and Michigan games. Penn State, in their victories last year, averaged 42 points a game. But those 42 points a game did not help them in a 20-12 loss to Ohio State or a 24-15 loss to Michigan. And both Michigan and Ohio State, here's adding insult to injury, guys, held Penn State below Michigan and Ohio State's season defensive average. So, yeah, it's tough for anybody to make hay against Penn State and Ohio State, but Penn State and Ohio State both had above average games against this. Ohio State and Michigan both had above average games defensively against this Penn State offense. So right after the second loss, they fired Mike Yurcich. They went down the stretch knowing they'd be on the hunt for a new OC. He targeted very early on Andy Kotelnicki. We know him well from Kansas. He's a very creative mind, a very well-respected offensive coordinator. He's a coach's coach. And so he looked at this roster, no doubt about it, from the outside looking in and recognized all the toys and all the bells and all the whistles. This is the Penn State recruiting class, guys, that 22 class that they have been saying for 3 years. This was the target year that this class would come of age, this 24 season. You had a pair of 5-star backs. You had the number 1 ranked quarterback in the country. You had all these studs populating this recruiting class, so many on the offensive side of the football. And that is what Mike Yurcich is about to have an opportunity to design plays, to execute, and have fun with, starting with Drew Aller. Let's get into some positions here, guys. Let's talk quarterback. Drew Aller, we're going to get into a little bit after we break down all the personnel on the offensive side of the ball. The 2 things that I think intrigue me the most about this Andy Kotelnicki transition from Kansas to Penn State. But Drew Aller was highly efficient. We saw the damage he could do last year when he threw for 3 bills plus and 3 touchdowns. Neil Brown has said, and he's right on the money, he was the difference in the football game in large measure last year. We kind of went blow for blow back and forth on the ground, but he made plays in the pass game. We didn't do a good enough job defending that. He was the difference in the passing game. So Drew Aller and a combination of Bo Prabula, this athletic kid that we recruited, is the guy that's number 2 behind him. And don't at all be surprised. We saw this out of Kotelnicki at Kansas. There are times that you might have 2 quarterback packages dialed up, but Drew Aller, he has the arm. He's just athletic enough to be sneaky athletic and hurt you with some conversions with his feet, and even hurt you in the red zone with his feet. But, I mean, he is a prototypical NFL-style quarterback with the big gun of an arm, even though that big gun wasn't deployed with what they were trying to do scheme-wise last year, as much as it might be with Kotelnicki this year. But let's start with the quarterbacks and go from there.
Yeah, I think Aller's an interesting player because I think, like you said, big arm, pretty athletic for his size. He's not the most dual threat quarterback in the world, but he can run it whenever needed. But I think the biggest thing for him is taking shots downfield. Obviously, he had a big shot last year against West Virginia, but there was a lot of dink and dunk last year. You look at the stats for him compared to Garrett Green. He had like 112 more pass attempts than Garrett, and only had, I think it was like 225 more yards. And that's with Garrett missing all of the Pitt game except for 6 plays. So there's still some room for growth there. But if he hits his ceiling, that kid's going to be an NFL quarterback. I don't know what his, if he's a first round pick or whatever, but there's a lot of potential there. The question I think for me is the receivers, because they lost Keandre Lambert-Smith. They lost their top tight end. They lost a lot of production out of that receiving room. You couple that with the inexperienced offensive line, some question marks for them on that side.
I like his pocket presence. I
Yeah,
really do. So one of the things that impressed me most last year, he made some check down throws that he had no business making because he was so nimble in the confines of a phone booth of a pass pocket that he found a way to get the football. I'm not even talking about the splash plays, the big touchdown to start the game. I'm talking about some check downs that he made that should have been sacks. I mean, he's just sneaky, nimble within the pocket. And guys, if they can lean on this two-headed monster on the ground, if they can find a way to do that with Katron Allen, who's more of a thumper, Nicholas Singleton, more the home run hitter, different skill sets, but highly productive when you put them in. They're considered co-starters by James Franklin. So they're both going to split duties and get more than their share of reps and their share of carries. But if they can make his life easier, which, trust me, Andy Kotelnicki's going to want to do that with Drew Aller breaking him into a new system. If you can make his life easier by setting up the run with Katron Allen, with Nicholas Singleton, find a way behind this retooled offensive line, it's going to make life a little easier. And then we're going to get into some of the pass catching elements of this offense. And then again, some of the questions that I have, and we'll talk about what they got going on front. Owen, what do you see? I see you've joined in down in beautiful Southern West Virginia from your car there. So what do you see? Same two backs we faced last year. What are you looking at with these two Penn State running backs? Is he muted? There he is.
Yeah, another explosive game. I mean, they're two tough running backs. Last year put a decent workload on them as far as the gameplay went against us. Can't let them control the clock, obviously, with what they got going on. And I'm sure they're going to try to establish the run up front. So we got to make sure to ground and pound like we did last year. And hopefully CJ can, find a workload that we can, use with him so he stays healthy, and have Jaheim be able to fill in those spots here and there. Then, like we've been kind of saying, who's going to be our third guy to kind of fill in that role to be able to take over some of those reps.
Trouble hearing Owen a little bit, but I get your point, Owen. I heard you talking about we can't let them chew the clock, and that's a great point in the sense that here's the deal. What I remember most about their last visit, Andy Kotelnicki's last visit to Morgantown, when they beat us in overtime in the shootout, the 55-42 game, what I remember most, and it might be strange, but they were 11 of 15 on third down. And one of the things Kansas does, they do a tremendous job of staying ahead of schedule, much like West Virginia. The only team in the Big 12 last year that was more run heavy on first down than West Virginia was Kansas, with Andy Kotelnicki calling the plays. 70% of the time, Andy Kotelnicki ran the football on first down, setting up second and third manageable situations on third down. What's intriguing about him, Kansas, from a short yardage standpoint on third down, was the most effective team in moving the sticks on third and short last year in the Big 12 with what Kotelnicki was drawing up. But also, and you hardly ever, if ever, see this, they were also the most productive team in moving the sticks on third and long. So there you see the best of both the pass game and the run game in terms of the creativity of Andy Kotelnicki. And when you look at what he's got to play with when he's trying to throw the football, Tyler Warren is back. It's a massive 6'6", 260-plus pound tight end. Last year, Penn State paired him up with Theo Johnson. Theo Johnson's now with the Giants. But they did a lot of creative things, and they were both highly productive. But the truth is, Tyler Warren was actually the guy they tended to lean on more than the guy who's now in the NFL. Tyler Warren started 12 to 13 games at 34 catches, 7 touchdowns, huge bowl game. And the loss to Ole Miss, 127 receiving yards. And when I think of what Andy Kotelnicki likes to do with the tight end, when I look at what he did at Kansas, I think of Mason Fairchild and how he was really productive. But in a conference like the Big 12 that's so tight end rich and deep, Mason Fairchild never got a lot of play or a lot of love. But even Jared Casey, remember the walk-on who was such a great story, who was kind of the fullback tight end hybrid? He got creative with some of the things he did with Jared Casey from an H-back / tight end position. And when you look at what he did in targeting his tight ends at Kansas with Kotelnicki targeted their tight ends 21% of the time, which was the 4th most of the 16 new teams in the Big 12. So he will find a way to design and manufacture touches for his tight ends. And that was with guys who weren't necessarily NFL types like what they have right now. And Skylar, you talked about the receiving group. Well, here's the concern that I have. Right now, we might not know what they have at receiver, but weren't we saying a lot of the same thing last year? We didn't know what they had at receiver last year. And all we did with that being the question mark on the offensive side of the football for Penn State last year was watch their quarterback throw for 325 yards on us. So when you look at what's happened to them this year, yes, they've been decimated by the portal. They had 5 kids transfer out. 4 of them landed at Power 5 programs. The big highlight one was, of course, Keandre Lambert-Smith, who had the big game against us last year. He's now hopping his wares at Auburn. But that doesn't mean that they don't have some potential in this room. Of course they do. Trey Wallace, he seems to be the guy getting a lot of buzz around camp. You hear James Franklin talking a lot about Trey Wallace on the perimeter, Liam Clifford at the slot position. They've got this OSU former 5-star transfer who came back home to Pennsylvania, and Julian Fleming, who's been at Ohio State the last couple of years. See what he might bring to the table. But there's a lot of potential in that room. And the conversation sounds eerily like it did last year when we had question marks heading up to Happy Valley with this receiver room last year. And finally, we'll wrap up from a personnel standpoint with the O-line. The O-line heading into last year had been a long time question mark for Penn State since they tried to rebuild this program. When they had those sanctions all the way back in 2011, lost scholarships, had these reductions, things like that. That is an area of their football program that a lot of people feel they never really found a way to get right until probably last year. So it took them a dozen years to get right. But I think they obviously did that, sending 3 starters to the NFL. But now the question is, you got an O-line coach in Phil Troutwine who has to find a way to replace those 3 starters. Maybe he will, in fact, find a way to do that. But the look of this offensive line is going to be different. The leadership now comes internally from right guard Sal Wormley. I mean, you got a bunch of four-star kids. You've got a number 1 junior college lineman. In other words, there's pieces that can be in place for them. But just as Skylar said, the question becomes, when you're replacing 3 starters up front and you're installing a new system, what's that going to look like?
The one thing I'll add to that real quick at the receivers too is West Virginia is going to be able to do more, we think, in terms of coverage because of Garnett Hollis and his size and length. He can play press man coverage. They like what they've seen out of Aiden Garnes. The secondary as a whole, even though it hasn't played much together, it's a more experienced group with guys coming in from all over. So I think just from this year compared to last year going to this Penn State game, they're going to be able to do more things in terms of coverage in the back end, which will also allow Jordan Leslie to dial up different types of pressures from all over the place. Aubrey Burks, like you mentioned, from the spear spot could come in and blitz off out of nowhere. So they've got so many different more, I think, abilities just from a play calling standpoint because of those 2 corners that they have.
I have 2 major questions with this transition on the offensive side for Penn State, and this sets up one of them, guys. When you look at what Penn State has been in the run game since James Franklin got on campus in 2014, and they've been a very zone-heavy run offense. In other words, more than half the time, sometimes well over half the time, zone more than gap scheme. Now, when you look at what Andy Kotelnicki has been deploying at Kansas, it's kind of just the opposite. Much more gap than zone his 3 years in Lawrence. The last 3 years, 53% of the time, 65% of the time, 54% of the time, he's run gap scheme as opposed to zone scheme. The flip side, and inversely at Penn State, it's been the entire time Franklin's been there, it's been over half the time the other way around. So part of that is going to be, now what's interesting, that's across the span of multiple offensive coordinators, from Joe Moorhead to Ricky Ron to Kirk Soraka, Mike Yurcich. So across the arc of time, that's obviously something that James Franklin philosophically believes in, but this is all going to be dictated by personnel. Because, for instance, when Andy Kotelnicki, before he got to Kansas, when he was at Buffalo, he was the other way around. He was more gap scheme than zone. So are you going to see a little heavier influence in this gap scheme? Now, to simplify things for the listeners and the viewers, gap scheme is typically when you see one or more of the offensive line pulling and you're man blocking and you're chopping things up and mixing things up that way, as opposed to, you've heard Owen and I break down zone blocking schemes in the run game so many times on the show. So that's question number one I have about the offense. What kind of influence might Kotelnicki bring? A little more gap scheme, even if you get up to 60% of the time running gap as opposed to zone, that's much more than what we've seen out of Penn State in the last decade.
Well, I mean, when you're talking about, the two principles of the schemes, gap schemes for some guys who are bigger, who can pull, in that zone, you kind of got that more athletic lineman. So it's really depicting on your personnel up front, I feel like, almost. And then, as far as a back perspective, some guys are more natural at running the zone than they are gap scheme, for instance. They don't have the patience to kind of wait on the block, per se. There's a lot of traffic that's got to pass when you're running a gap scheme type of offense.
So that is something we're going to have to keep an eye on and monitor, because defensively, it presents a different challenge. You got new linebackers for West Virginia on the defensive side of the football. By and large, some new faces there. Once we're healthy, we're young. So that's something to consider. That's question number one I have. But we're going to work our way into question number two. First of all, one of the other things when you study Andy Kotelnicki over the arc of time that he's done at Kansas, he loves to attack you when throwing the football between the hashes. He pushes the football upfield between the hashes, stresses the linebackers, makes them conflict defenders. For instance, well over half the time, Jason Bean and Jalen Daniels, 56% of the time, their pass attempts were between the hashes, oftentimes upfield. We're going to break down some of these numbers for you. As a team, 54%. What's interesting, when he had Tyree Jackson, the big kid at Buffalo, when he faced Neal in the bowl game, he didn't throw between the hashes as much. He worked the perimeter more. So once again, the question is, what's he going to settle into with Drew Aller? Because here's something I want to talk about, guys. He is going to fundamentally be asking Drew Aller to push the ball vertically way more than Drew Aller was asked to do so last year. We've talked in the past on the show about the metric called average depth of target. That's a pretty strong indicator in terms of how consistently you push the football deep. It takes all your throws, both complete and incomplete, and how many air yards on average is your average throw. For instance, Garrett Green led the Big 12 with an average depth of target 13.5 yards because we were going deep so often. Well, guess who was right behind Garrett Green at 13.4 yards? Jason Bean of Kansas. He was number 2 in the Big 12. Guess who was number 1 in the Big 12 with the deepest average depth of target in 2022? Jason Bean of Kansas. Go all the way back to Tyree Jackson of Buffalo in 2018 when Kotelnicki and Lance Leipold were on that staff running that offense. Guess what Tyree Jackson's was? 13.8. Number 1 in the Mid-American Conference at a completely different school. He was doing the same thing, pushing the football deep. So here are those numbers again, 13, 11, 14. Guess what Drew Aller's average depth of target was last year with Mike Yurcich at Penn State? 8.0 yards. And when you look at the percentage of throws made through the air at least 20 yards downfield, Jason Bean last year at Kansas, 25% of all his throws were 20 yards downfield. Again, go back to Tyree Jackson at Buffalo with Kotelnicki. 28% of all his throws were 20 yards downfield. So 28 and 25. both, more than 1 out of every 4 of their throws were 20 yards downfield. Drew Aller last year, only 9% of his throws were 20 yards downfield. So one of a couple things is going to happen. Either Andy Kotelnicki is going to have to fundamentally transform his passing game to fit his new personnel, or he's going to have to coach Drew Aller up and say, look, what I ask of you is much different than what you were asked within the confines of that offense a year ago. We push the football deep. We don't dink and dunk. And this really puts this in context, guys. Only 14 Power 5 quarterbacks had an average depth of target of 8.0 or less. Like I just mentioned, Drew Aller's was 8.0. Only 14 in all Power 5 were 8.0 or less. Among those, only one had a lower completion percentage than Drew Aller at 59.6%. So meanwhile, we spend the whole offseason hearing about Garrett Green, 53%. What's the problem? All right. Well, the problem is we're not dinking and dunking. We're pushing the ball vertical. Penn State was literally dinking and dunking, and he couldn't complete 60% of his throws. So either you have to cater your offense very heavily toward his skill set, and it's going to look a lot different than what Kansas did when they threw the football, or you're going to have to get Drew Aller up to speed if you want to run the offense that you've been running at Kansas and at Buffalo when you throw the football, because that is not on any level the offense that Drew Aller's been running at Penn State. Now, that's not to say he's not capable, but because we've talked about his big arm strength, he was recruited so highly for a reason. But stay tuned. So my first question, gap scheme versus zone scheme, what kind of impact will Kotelnicki have at Penn State? Maybe a little more gap, we'll see. And my second question is, how consistently is he going to ask Drew Aller to do what he never had to do last year and push the football downfield beyond 20 yards with any level of consistency? And oh, by the way, when Drew Aller did throw it beyond 20 yards, he only completed 31%, whereas Jason Bean completed 49% at Kansas last year. See what I'm saying? There's kind of a problem here unless it's addressed. So let's see what Kotelnicki has in mind or has up his sleeve to do about that as you're breaking in a bunch of new receivers as well.
Yeah, particularly the first game of the season on the road too, right? I mean, it's it'd be one thing if you were opening up at home, you're opening up at home against somebody. I always hate doing that. Like, who's the program that I have to pick to take the shot at, right? So all due respect to the good people at Delaware State, but yeah, it's a little bit different if you're opening against Delaware State, and you're Penn State at home. With 3 new offensive linemen and a new offensive coordinator and new wide receivers, as opposed to on the road against a WVU team, with some continuity and a rabid home field advantage as well too. So that's kind of the question with all of that for me as well too, Jed, is not only what does all that look like, but how quickly can they get the kinks worked out? How quickly can they all get on the same page? Realistically, what can they accomplish week 1? Because, I mean, anytime you're installing a new offensive coordinator, your offense ain't looking the same week 7, week 8, week 9 as it does week 1. So that to me is, hey, do they have a couple bumps in the road in that regard? Yeah.
I mean, they're all breaking in the new video technology. They're all breaking operationally. They're on the headsets as a staff together for the first time. So they don't speak each other's shorthand. They're trying to work out all those things in front of 60,000 screaming maniacs. And it's not ideal. It's less than optimal for them. No doubt about it. So, and here's one other strange little factoid. 3 different times, Andy Kotelnicki, as an offensive play caller, as an offensive coordinator, has faced Neil Brown's staff. We mentioned at least the first one in the 2018 in the bowl game, the Dollar General Bowl, Buffalo faced Troy. So what I looked at was, okay, how did Kotelnicki fare versus what Neil's defenses were giving up on average? And here's the little quirky thing. All 3 times, Kotelnicki benefited from a defensive touchdown in the game. It's so weird. In the Dollar General Bowl, there was a long fumble return for a touchdown. In 2021 in Lawrence, Gavin Potter had a pick 6 against West Virginia for a touchdown. And of course, remember the Kobe Bryant pick 6 in overtime. So all 3 games he benefited from a touchdown. So scrap out the defensive points. I'm just going with the points that Kotelnicki's offense scored. So in the bowl game, Troy won the bowl game 42-32, but scrap out the offensive touchdown. Kotelnicki's offense scored 3 more than Troy's defense was giving up on average. Go to 2021 in Lawrence, the 34-28 West Virginia win. Once again, the Kotelnicki offense scored 3 more than the West Virginia defense was giving up on average. And then finally, the big one was the overtime loss in Morgantown. Even when you remove the defensive touchdown, Kotelnicki's defense scored 17 more points than West Virginia's defense was giving up on average. So that gives you some kind of indication. I looked at the production from a passing and rushing standpoint. It's kind of interesting to dive deep into that because that's a pretty extensive body of work when you faced each other 3 times over multiple schools now. So that's some indicator too in terms of what they might try and do.
Going to be interesting, that's for sure. Very, very interesting. Thanks to our friends at Fortis, our guy Rick Lewis, for roof performance and financial certainty guaranteed. You got to visit fortis.us.com. All right, Jed, before we get to our buddy Cody Alexander, welcoming him back to the podcast for the second time to take a deep dive into the Penn State defense, I know you want to go over some more personnel from that Penn State side first as well.
Yeah, we didn't dive into the personnel with Cody. It was more big picture scheme stuff, and he did a great job of breaking that down. But when you look at the 4-2-5 version that Tom Allen is going to bring from Indiana, there are parallels between some of what you saw, and you hear Cody talk about this, with Manny Diaz last year. He's also an even front guy, but his comes more from a 4-3 into a 4-2-5, where Tom Allen has the versatility to go from a 4-2-5 sometimes into a 3-3 type of look. But from a personnel standpoint, Penn State, here's the good and here's the bad. The good is they lost 3 corners to the NFL. The bad is they probably got 3 more right behind them. I mean, they're not going to be hurting a corner, even though they're breaking in some new faces there. They returned both their safeties, and that's a very critical piece of what Tom Allen's going to try and do within the scheme. They have what's called the quote-unquote lion safety. He's called it different things at different stops. But this is the guy who lines up opposite the free safety. It looks like it's probably going to be Jalen Reed. So look for Penn State defensively, number 1 jersey number. He's going to be floating around. And this is a guy who has to have instincts to play the ball in space. He has to have versatility, and he has to be aware of where he is on the field and where the football is. That's kind of the skill set needed for this position. From a production standpoint, I think maybe one of their best defenders, and that's saying a lot, is Kevin Winston. Who's also on the back end at safety, number 2. He's going to be flying around. He's going to be making plays. But it all comes down to the 2 edge guys. What they've done is they've taken Abdul Carter, number 11, who was an inside backer last year. They've moved him to the edge. He played a lot on the edge last year anyway. He's truly one of these Swiss Army knife, Micah Parsons types that you can move around. As you'll hear Cody talk about, I wouldn't be surprised if in some third down situations you see him kind of mugging up the A-gaps to try and sneak in there. But even on the other side, yes, they lost Chop Robinson to the NFL draft and Aiden Isaac to the NFL draft, but they've got 2 NFL guys back. We mentioned Abdul Carter, but Danny Dennis Sutton on the other side, the other 5 technique, he was probably their most consistent pass rusher a year ago. So there's going to be a lot of things playing out there, but we talked about new faces at corner, but when you're at Penn State, those new faces mean a highly coveted recruit from a couple years ago in Cam Miller and 2 SEC transfers. Those are your top 3. So it's not as though they're hurting, but one final thing to make a note of before I toss back to you here, Wes. On the interior defensive line, we talked about their edge guys, but on the interior of that defensive line, they go 4 deep. They return their top 4 defensive tackle body types. And you heard Neil talk about this. If, in fact, it's going to be hot as expected, yes, depth might matter. So the fact they can cycle guys in and cycle guys out, those 300-pounders or those guys pushing 300 pounds. So keep an eye on also when West Virginia might try and weaponize some version of tempo to maybe keep a couple of those big body guys on the field if we get some kind of rhythm developed. See if we put the pedal down with a little bit of tempo and roll with it.
Yeah, I think too with the offensive
Yeah,
line. With the offensive line, I mean, this is quite a test for Nick Malone, right? I mean, you're coming in, you're probably going to get the start. We don't know for sure the depth chart yet. That's not going to get rolled out until probably hours before the game, but we all assume that he's going to be the starting right tackle. And this is quite the first test for him. I don't think anyone's really worried about Wyatt Milam and how he's going to handle this test because he passed it with flying colors a year ago, and he's passed it every single game with flying colors. But for Nick Malone, This is a kind of a get your feet wet, but thrown into the fire type of situation at the same time.
And Traylon Davis.
Yeah, and Traylon Davis, yeah.
We went 12 personnel first play of the game last year in Happy Valley, guys. Remember? So
yeah.
Sure
don't
did.
rule anything out. I mean, when you got edge rushers like that, you want to help those tackles out.
Love it.
Sometimes that comes in the form of chipping with those backs. It's nice to see we got CJ healthy. Jaheim, that's an area of his game that's really improved. So there's that tight end room between Cole and Traylon. So it's going to be all hands on deck. It really is.
Well, all hands on deck here on In the Gun, as we've got the four of us together here for the for a rare occasion, certainly. But all hands on deck also sometimes means some of our friends here on this program as well, too. So our buddy Cody Alexander taking some time to discuss all of this and more with us. We'll hear what Cody has to say on the other side of this break. You are In the Gun.
Nobody supports the blue and gold Mountaineers like Toothman Ford. With over 20 NIL deals and counting, Toothman Ford continues to rally behind our student athletes. And it's time we rally and support the dealer that supports the Mountaineers. Not only does Toothman Ford offer the best prices in the state on pre-owned, their never over MSRP campaign on new Fords guaranteed to save you thousands. Drive with pride all season long, knowing you're supporting the dealer that fuels our Mountaineers. Toothman Ford, where cars cost less. In Grafton and at toothmanford.com.
In Morgantown, West Virginia, on the campus of West Virginia University, Mountaineers enjoy walking in where angels fear to tread. They will meet the invaders. They will do battle as a prohibitive underdog, but they will play this game with the knowledge that anything can happen in football. On any given field, it can happen.
For nearly 20 years, Fortis has been the nation's leader in providing guaranteed roof performance programs for commercial buildings. Fortis offers roof performance solutions that feature extensive initial and ongoing reconditioning for commercial buildings as an alternative to traditional replacement, with long-term performance guarantees that are backed by global leader Lloyd's of London. Fortis offers a comprehensive range of roof performance management programs that provide financial security, extend the life of our customers' roofs, and make a significant impact on ROI. Fortis is currently improving performance and increasing ROI for customers at more than 4,800 locations, with more than 140 million square feet protected, including many Fortune 500 companies that have turned to Fortis to save money, gain financial certainty, and extend the life of their existing roofs. Fortis has helped customers save more than $520 million in capital roof replacement costs for an average ROI of over 250%. To learn more, visit fortis.us.com. Fortis, roof performance and financial certainty guaranteed. Back in the gun here on episode 182, the PSU preview, and who better to join the show here, join the program, than a new friend. You remember Cody Alexander of Match Quarters, of course, from back over the summer. He joined Jed and I for a PhD level defensive breakdown of Jordan Leslie and the Mountaineers. Well, we've got Cody back now to talk Penn State, talk this defense, talk a little Tom Allen, new defensive coordinator of the Nittany Lions this season. Cody, what's going on, man? Thanks for being back.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Really appreciate it.
Go ahead, Jed. I know. And listen, he broke the West Virginia internet. I mean, he did the opposite of breaking your heart. He endeared himself to your heart with all the, again, the PhD level breakdowns and conversations. So this is, again, there's certain interviews we do here on ITG where, you know, one leads and one kind of follows. This is one where I'm just going to sit back and take notes and maybe chime in from time to time. But Jed, I know you're ready to hit it here with Cody.
Well, as we're previewing all things Penn State, as the Nittany Lions are just a few days away from rolling into Morgantown, the invaders from the north, I was thinking about what they're doing on the defensive side of the football. Of course, you have new coordinators everywhere you turn in Happy Valley. And one of the things that Coach Franklin said, he wanted to hire a head coach on offense and a head coach on defense. In other words, a head coach for his offense and for his defense. On the defensive side, he almost literally did that with former Indiana head coach Tom Allen. And when I was thinking about breaking down and explaining to Mountaineer fans what we might expect, both good and bad, from this somewhat new look Penn State defense, I immediately thought of Cody, because I know Cody has somewhat of a pedigree in the 4-2-5 defense, which is what Penn State's going to be running. A lot of parallels to what they did. We'll get into that with Manny Diaz, but you are the guy that I thought could best explain what we might anticipate. So I'm going to let you kind of take this and run with it in terms of the best place to start. New coordinator at Penn State. We're going to see him in a few days. He spent some time as the head coach at Indiana. Previously, he was the D coordinator at South Florida, bounced around as an assistant elsewhere. He's coached for a long time. But once again, let's talk about this 4-2-5 scheme, his version of it, or at least what his fingerprints on it might look like coming out of camp for the Penn State Nittany Lions.
Yeah, so it's going to be a traditional 4-2-5 in the sense of what you typically have seen in college, really in the last decade and plus from that. So they're going to have some sort of a nickel defender that can play some coverage, can play some man when asked to do it. He kind of is more of a cover 3 guy, but the one thing that will be a departure from Penn State that I believe is that they were very man heavy last year with Manny Diaz. Manny Diaz really wanted to play a lot of man pressure, send a lot of 5-man pressures. That's going to be a little bit rolled back. They're going to have a more of a diverse coverage shell than what we're normally accustomed to seeing with Penn State, who really has been trying to play man and has had NFL man corners now for really the past couple of years. So to me, that will be the biggest departure. I don't think the defense that you saw last year is going to change that much. So if you remember back to that game last year, it's going to look very much the same. They're just going to be playing a lot more zone and a lot less man.
So how sneaky are they going to be out of their zone concepts? Because when I think of Manny Diaz predicated almost everything he did on knocking you off schedule on early downs. He wanted to force first down incompletions. He was huge on that. He wanted a bunch of 2nd and 10s to lead to 3rd and longs. And he brought pressure. He penetrated. He was disruptive. Their negative play rate, Cody, at Penn State last year was insane. I think he had 14% of their plays were knocked you behind the line of scrimmage. Now, it was pretty obvious how he went about doing that, but it was just a tall task to try and stop it. What might be some of the subtle or less than subtle differences as opposed to the aggression we saw with last year's Penn State defense?
Yeah, so first of all, the blitz rate is going to get peeled back. I mean, Penn State had like almost a 50% blitz rate last year. This will probably be peeled back to almost probably a little bit over a third of their plays. You're going to see a blitz. I thought one thing that Diaz added to his repertoire that he did not have prior, and this is really that Brent Pry influence of going back and watching film, and probably James Franklin saying, hey, we want to keep this as part of what we're doing is the simulated pressures, meaning that we're really only sending 4, but we're kind of pinpointing where we want that off-ball backer. They were a big off-ball backer, just off-ball backers, just your 2 inside linebackers in the 4-2-5. So they're not on the line and really, working the middle of the box. What's really interesting is if you watch Indiana the last 3 years and then you watch Penn State the last 2 years, the blitz patterns are all relatively similar. They're trying to attack the interior of the box. They're using off-ball backers to really kind of mess with that center. They do what I call floating the center, meaning that they're going to get in a traditional 4-down front and they're going to rock that nose out to a 3. So they're going to take him from the A gap. They're going to move him to the B gap. And what that does is it floats that center. And what I mean by floating is he really doesn't have anybody over him. So if he chases that nose, then you can backdoor him on a pressure. And that's where they get that. If he wants to just sit there, then that's where you get that jab, step, and go. And that's what linebackers are working on blitz through cans and all the stuff that we see a million times in camp. So that's really what they're trying to attack. This defense is really good at attacking zone-centric offenses. So I am interested to see kind of how it matches up probably a little bit with West Virginia just running a lot of more outside zone, inside zone, things like that. Counter is kind of the same thing. You kind of get the same thing. But when you start adding a tight end, you start doing different things. That's when the 5-man pressures really come up. But that, to me, when you look at this, what is Tom Allen going to bring this a little different than Manny Diaz? Again, more coverage diversity. It's not going to be a lot of fire zone, 3 under, 3 deep coverages. It's not going to be a lot of man heavy. Now, if you have the cats to run man, we all know this, you run man. So do I expect them to run like right under 20% of man coverage like they did at Indiana? Probably not. That probably gets bumped up to 25%-ish. I mean, just because you have the guys there. But I think that's kind of what you're looking at with Tom Allen. You're going to get the same blitz patterns, more 5-man pressures. The other thing that he does not do that Manny Diaz did was run stunts. So he's not going to move that line unless he's bringing pressure behind it. In fact, they ran like 8% run stunts in the 3 years that he was at Indiana. And so what does that mean? They're just not moving the line when on normal downs. They're letting those guys kind of get after the ball in their gap and kind of playing off of that.
One of the things I was going to ask you, and you started to address it there. When you think back to what you saw him doing at Indiana, first of all, this guy was, AFCA National Coach of the Year in 2020. They had a great season. The COVID season, they were 6-2. The year before that, had a great run. A lot of people remember when you mentioned those Indiana teams for that brief spurt. Most people are going to say, "Oh, Michael Penix." But that 2020 team, in large measure led by Tom Allen on the defensive side of the football, was fourth in the Big Ten in scoring defense. Now, you talked about the personnel differences between what he had with a bunch of 3-stars in Indiana. That dictates what you're going to do scheme-wise sometimes. Now he's showing up, and irrespective of whether Penn State lost their 3 top corners to the NFL draft or not, trust me when I say they're going to shuffle in 3 more NFL corners. So just as you talked about, the personnel is going to put him in a position of leverage to do some things that maybe at Indiana he didn't do as much of. You say he bumps it up maybe 5-10% from a pressure standpoint. What other kind of differences might you anticipate because of the luxury of the personnel he's going to have?
Well, just before we begin, I think people need to understand like Tom Allen is one of the better defensive minds in college football. If you go and you look at his tree, like he has Kane Womack, who's at South Alabama, who's very well, and who now is at Alabama, who is very well respected around the country, has run and has been running this defense at South Alabama, and then will be running this defense at Alabama.
Then the Oklahoma State game last year.
Exactly.
To me, when South Alabama marched in there, did that to him. Yeah.
Yes. And so if you can kind of like piecemeal this together of what this might actually look like. So it's going to be, instead of cover 1, probably going to be more cover 3. They do run cover 1 a little bit more when they're doing this. It's going to be a lot of 5-man pressures where they're mixing things up. I think they're going to add a different coverage diversity. Look, Manny Diaz wanted to run cover 1 and they wanted to run trap 2 off of that. So, and because what do you do when you run a lot of cover 1? You run cover 2 as the complement, because that's what complements each other. So just what do I think? Like we need to understand Tom Allen mentored these guys. So like Kane Womack, and then the Greery kid who's now with Ohio State.
Yeah.
Right. So that guy, and two, he is just, if you don't know in the business, he's a rising star within this business as well. It's not going to be very long until he's got his own another coordinator job, probably in the Big Ten or somewhere else, maybe even the SEC, because he is good. He runs a system that is very complemented with and is kind of on trend with what everybody's going on. So to me, when you get extra talent, you can get away with a little bit of things. They have edge rushers at Penn State. They always have, like, really, if you go back the past couple of years, I mean, really since Michael Parsons, they've had somebody that was a big time edge rusher. Cobb Robinson, he's at Miami, right? But they have a guy, and so they have another guy now too. So I think like you can really lean into these things. I mean, if you really break him down the way that he did this, when he did blitz, he was still running about 30% cover 1. That probably gets bumped up. You know, that was kind of the thing with Manny Diaz, is that it was really heavy into the fire zones when you're running 5-man pressures and things like that. So I think that there's a few things that, you know, kind of are going to stay the same. The defensive structure will stay the same, obviously. But when you have a little bit more talent, you can kind of get away and you can try more things, or you kind of get this other – people are really weird. You either try and do more things or you just end up running base a lot more. So it will be interesting to see like what you get in game 1.
And there's so many toys to play with. You talked about Chop Robinson, what he brought last year. He was just a stud. And, you know, you would say Chop Robinsons don't grow on trees, but not so fast. Penn State, what they're going to do personnel-wise, it looks like Abdul Carter was one of their backers last year. They're going to slide him down into that slot playing defensive end, so he'll be at the 5 technique, so Mountaineer fans can anticipate him oftentimes being outside shoulder of Wyatt Milam, being outside shoulder of Nick Malone. Some of what you saw him do against what he expected to be run-heavy teams at Indiana. And this is something else I wanted to ask you, because going into the season, you have to think that's how they're game planning West Virginia. You would almost see him rotate some things around and do some subbing. It almost was akin to a 5-2 look. Like I remember the Indiana State game when they played the Sycamores. Indiana State had struggled like crazy to throw the football the week prior. So they went with a very run-heavy defensive posture. in almost this 5-2 alignment. So do you expect maybe something like that? And also tie into your answer, this is only Brandon Yates' second game of his career starting at center. He started in the bowl game against North Carolina. It's a big ask to replace Zach Frazier, obviously. So how much pre-snap movement and creativity do you see him utilizing or deploying to test the communication of this West Virginia offensive line with Brandon Yates at center, who's still kind of settling into that role?
Yeah, and two, I think that that's a trend that we're seeing, kind of a trickle down trend from the NFL. These 4-down teams trying to get into these odd structures. All odd means is that they're covering both B gaps. They're getting into a 5-man alignment, and so moving guys around. Having Abdul Carter is an easy way, much like to go with another Penn State guy, much like what Dan Quinn did with Micah Parsons last year. Is you use him off ball, move him to on ball, get into an odd spacing alignment. Move him back, blitz him off ball, do different things, put him over the center on third down. These are all things that I think that you're going to see, because when you have a guy like that that's special, it's really players over plays. I know we make a lot of, and I'm a scheme head, so like I watch all the scheme and I'm really in tune to it. But at the end of the day, it's about players over plays. And when you have a guy like that, it's about getting him one-on-one matchups. So how do you get one-on-one matchups? 5-man pressures are an easy way to do that. Georgia's been making a killing off of 5-man pressures really the last couple of years because they're so good up front. They have really good blitzing linebackers. How do you get one-on-ones? You send 5. So we're going to put our 5 guys on your 5 guys. We're going to win a one-on-one somewhere. And then being able to move guys around, being able to move Abdul Carter and sit him on top of the center. So like you said, you have an inexperienced center. Every third down, he's my mug guy. I'm bringing another guy on, whether it's a younger guy or an established veteran that we have on the roster that I know is going to give me a good or a decent pass rush, because now I'm applying pressure in the middle of the field. And I think their blitz game of what they really do and what they want to do with a lot of these A-gap pressures, that's right there on the center, like I said earlier. So floating the center, making him work, having him figure out where the off-ball guy's going, kind of using that smoke and mirrors, dropping guys back, folding them in, kind of create layers in that run fit. That's exactly what Tom Allen has been doing at Indiana, and that's exactly what he's probably going to do when he comes to Penn State.
I'm glad you mentioned the Georgia stuff, because I want to direct people, if they want a better understanding of that. You did a great job fleshing that out at matchquarters.com. You wrote a great piece on that. But yeah, Brandon Yates, he's played a lot of football. He started all 5 positions for us. He just hasn't been asked to line up against one of the best defenses in the nation, which they were last year. Mm-hmm. And they returned their top 4 defensive linemen, what they have on the second level. But you've been so kind with your time. I want to close with a couple more questions that maybe will give West Virginia fans a little spring in their step. Let's talk about different things you might be able to do. Let me position these questions like this to attack this. People talk about the strength of the 4-2-5 always being the balanced look of it. In other words, against the spread offense, you can cover while maintaining 6 defenders in the box. You don't have to move around. Your basic alignment allows you to do that. In your base defense, if you're in a 3-4, you can't stay in base. You can accommodate things, but you got to get out of your base look. And if you have athletic defensive backs with versatility, which you know Penn State will, you can get crazy with the list of coverages that you can roll out. Now, from a weakness standpoint, people often say that it's an asymmetrical defense. So in other words, offenses can scheme to the weak side with a little more ease than against maybe a 3-4 or maybe a 4-3. So let's talk about that, to the weak side of this 4-2-5 that we expect Penn State to give us such a steady diet of. What might that look like conceptually? What type of packages might we be looking at? And for that matter, let's talk maybe formation to the boundary type stuff, because that can kind of throw a wrinkle into the game plan of some defenses that are trying to stay even-handed in terms of right up the middle. So walk us through some of that, and then I have one more question from a weakness standpoint.
Yeah, I really think too, like a lot of the things, and I think we talked about this last time, like playing some pistol, playing some wide zone, getting a tight end on there to really make them kind of define what they want to do. Going formation into the boundary against the 4-2-5 really makes that defense decide, are we going to pull the chain, meaning that we're going to bump everything over, or are we going to be nickel over? So we're going to actually bring the nickel back over. Once you bring the nickel over, which is where we kind of are right now, a lot of people want the coverage, nickel to be with the speed. So they'll take it with that. Is now you open yourself up for more motion. I think we're finally getting to the point where even air raid coaches are like, okay, we got to start using some motion in our offense. It's just too much. It's just too much. There's too much analytics behind it. There's too much science behind it, saying and telling everybody, look, if you use pre-snap motion, you're going to open yourself up down the field. It's going to kind of make that defense a little bit more passive. And so that's where I think like you can do some things to mess with the structure of that. And to attack those B gaps and figure out how they're going to play that B gap. So they're going to be in a scrape exchange team, meaning that the defensive end is going to try and close that B gap, whether it's, I call it a heavy technique, where no matter what against run, he's going to try and get his face in the B gap. So you're going to have to scrape exchange. There's different ways to play that. Quarterback run game, obviously in any kind of single high, is always going to pick that up. And so attacking that B gap, making some, if they're attaching a linebacker, no matter what, to the B gap, you always have opportunities there for the RPOs, being able to kind of toy with him in the coverage system, force them to get into man, and then you run your man beaters, things like that. So I think that there are ways, obviously, to attack this. A lot of, start running some more trap plays, depending on how much they want to do up front. And if they're not stunting up front, you kind of have an idea of where they're going to be. So if they're blitzing, let's say it's about a 35% rate, 36% rate, you kind of have an idea of when that's going to come. If they're early down, we have an idea of what pressure. They usually like that internal A-gap pressure. So your center kind of has an idea of what's coming. Gap schemes can give them problems sometimes as well, just because there's a lot of moving. And the way that they kind of fold that defensive end primarily away from the pressure, you kind of can get a soft edge. That's where I think wide zone really helps you. And then obviously with that motion, those are some things that you can go. And I really like your idea with formation in the boundary. Anytime you can get formation in the boundary and really mess with, especially teams that want to try and sit in the cover three, you can really mess with them that way.
I want to explain this in simple terms that people might understand. What you're trying to do when you go formation to the boundary, let's say the ball's on the left hash, and you go in a basic alignment to the wide side of the field, wide right. Well, now the defense has the luxury. They don't have to choose to defend personnel or grass. They can do both. They can defend the wide side of the field where your heavy numbers are in your formation, plus where the wide side of the field is. But when you kick your formation to the short side, now you're forcing them to declare. They have to choose. All right, are we going to defend the numbers to the boundary, to the short side, or are we going to defend the grass to the wide side, to the space? And when you talk about the motion, the movement, the thing, all the eye candy that tests the eye discipline of the defense, that's one of the things. I don't know how much offensively you've studied West Virginia the last year and a half with Chad Scott and Neil Brown, but they call them free hitters. They have this laundry list of motions and resets and shifts just to simplify things for Garrett. It really does. It puts the defense in a more passive posture, as you said, puts them on their heels. And, in a 4-2-5 scheme, you're not really reading post-snap as much as you're reacting. But the other thing I wanted to ask you about, we'll close with this. This defense also calls for a certain skill set out of that. At Indiana, he called it the Husky safety spot. I'm not sure what he's calling it at Penn State. I'm sure it'll have a different name. It's typically the free safety, just in vanilla terms. But they have to have instincts to play the plus side of the field, the boundary side of the field. They have to be a versatile player, and they have to understand space and route concepts. And I'm sure he will have that. But here's my question. A basic note, if you want to get this, distill this down to its basic essence, 4-2-5 schemes, they tend to allow a lot of big plays. I think back to Gary Patterson, when they're not communicating well. Anytime he was putting new faces on that back end from a safety standpoint and they had communication breakdowns, we made a lot of big plays. We made a lot of hay in the throw game against those Patterson defenses, despite how talented and productive they were because of communication breakdowns. That's true of any offensive course, but just the very basic nature of this 4-2-5 probably makes it more of a prominent issue. Now, let's revisit the fact we're getting Penn State. If in fact there's an advantage, we're getting them with new coordinators on both sides of the ball. Yes, we have to have, there's some guesswork involved, but at the same time, those new coordinators are trying to work out the kinks on the fly in Morgantown in front of 60,000 maniacs, making their life difficult. So do you think they'll have that communication piece sorted out on the back end as early as that first game in Morgantown. You've been through installations of this type of scheme. What can we expect in that first week when all they've done right now is internal scrimmages to test it, right? Am I crazy, or might I assume, okay, they're not going to be as buttoned up as they might otherwise be, and there might be some opportunities for us to take advantage of some of those things in addition to trying to generate some problems with formation of the boundary, shifting motions. They might just, by the very nature of the scheme, have some communication problems and breakdowns because they're not quite there yet. Now, a lot of that they'll compensate with talent, but just take that and run with it, Cody.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that's unique about the college system is that you just don't have scrimmages. So you can't test this out against something else. There's a point in camp where you kind of have an idea of what's coming next, or you have to start giving your offense the plays that you're going to see in week 1 and maybe even week 2, depending on what your schedule looks like. So I do think that there is merit to, especially like doing some things that maybe West Virginia hasn't done last year, maybe new things that they've been working on in the spring and then in the fall camp. Offensively, I think offenses have the advantage early in the season, and I think defenses have the advantage late in the season. That's why they say, and I truly believe it's like defenses win championships, offenses are going to win you games. So you still have to be able to score points to win games. But I think great defenses is what's going at the end of the year that's when it gets it, because it kind of levels out at some point during the year. So I do think, especially with the motions and the shifts and then trying to have that communication piece. And see, here's the other thing, like Tom Allen, he's had some really talented guys come through underneath of him that are trying to do things. They're at different places. So, he's communicating with them and seeing what he is. Hey, it's been a while since he's been a defense coordinator. Hey, I need to update kind of what we were doing. And just remember, he was not calling it, really since he was the head coach. So him now going back to how do I call it, things like that, there's going to be a little bit. So if you're asking, like, is this a game that maybe we could catch them off guard? 100% that this is a game that you can catch them off guard, especially with the way that the offense is going to be installing new things. The defense is going to have to figure that out. And that communications piece, I mean, he's not just running man coverage and fire zones and some, where Manny Diaz was relatively easy because man is man. And it's just like,
that's a good
point. Got to figure, you know what I mean? Like, you got to figure out, okay, what are we doing with stacks? Are we carrying?
Cody, we're doing this with 3 new corners. Yes, they're going to be NFL talent, but we're talking about just the communication piece. That's a great point on your part.
Yeah, and to me, that's when you do more on the back end, you're always kind of in the situation of, okay, how well are they getting taught? And that's going to be the biggest thing at the college level, because a lot of these guys, I really truly believe that there are some guys that are just recruiters and then there's some guys that are coaches. And it really just depends. Sometimes in some of these places, especially at these top programs, like the coordinator is really the only guy, doing the coaching. Like, he's the one that's like, hey, this is what we're doing in practice. This is the drills that I want you to run. And look, I don't know anything about the Penn State staff, but I am just saying, like, there are other elements at the college game that you don't necessarily have to worry about at the NFL game. And then even at the at the high school level where, you're teaching these things. So they have had plenty of time, but you never know until you step on the field at the college level, because you haven't had a scrimmage other than against your own team.
Wes, I'll say that's a good place to end this thing, but he has me so intrigued because I'm thinking back to Garrett Green's skill set. And a year ago, one of the worst things you could do was try and apply pressure. Not only when he threw the football was he dangerous and highly effective from, a big-time throw rate, maybe the highest in the last decade against the blitz from Pro Football Focus, but oftentimes he would also escape. Yeah. And when somebody like Garrett escapes a missed blitz, there are gaping holes on the second level. So if Penn State, in fact, is not going to blitz like Manny Diaz did quite as much, and maybe sit back in a more basic cover 3. Now I'm also intrigued because Garrett, we spent the whole off season, 53% passer, 53% passer. Well, you want to rectify that 53%, take some easy high lows in the flat against the cover 3 defense and take what they give you. Next thing you know, you're already in the mid-60s, maybe not as many big plays, but Cody, you gave me a lot to think about. Combined with the tape that I've been watching, you gave me plenty to think about.
Cody, that means he's gonna be up till 2 or 3 in the morning taking notes and watching different cut-ups and things of that nature now. Cody Alexander, thank you so much for your time. Fascinating as always. Just before you go, tell the people where they can find you, where they can get more of your work.
Yeah, everything you want from me is found at matchquarters.com. I've got links to everything from social media to books to clinics to articles. Everything you need is at matchquarters.com.
That's our guy, Cody Alexander. We will be back with more of this PSU preview on the other side. You are in the gun.
ITG.
There are better-known tractors in the world than Coyote. Ones with bigger names, longer histories, more popular hats, cute toy lines. But there's not a single tractor ever been built that's better equipped to do the dirty work. So we'll just focus on what really matters. Coyote, we dig dirt.
Get 0% financing for up to 84 months with approved credit on select Coyote tractors in stock now at Johnston Equipment. Route 33 between Weston and Buchanan.
Back in the gun here as we close down episode 182, our PSU preview. And real quick, before we just get some final picks and everything and get out of here, I just want to say Monday, Neil Brown's still rocking the goatee at his press conference. All right, we got to keep the goatee going. The power of the goatee. Jed's got his rocking. I've been growing mine out here for about 3 weeks, but I'm not really getting anywhere. But as long as Neil Brown's got the full goatee, I'm believing, baby. So, Jed, we've been doing this now for a couple years, different picks every single week here on the show. But just to remind people who might have missed it, or maybe you've just recently hopped on to the In the Gun podcast here, your new favorite WVU football podcast. Real simple. Jed will give a signal caller of the week, which team, which quarterback throw for the most yards in the Big 12 conference, and this is Big 12 specific we do this for. Big O, same thing, but he does the beer truck of the week as it relates to the running game and the running backs. Skylar does offense of the week, who's going to score the most points. I do defense of the week, who is going to give up the least amount of points. And as always, we'll start with the valedictorian, the top of the class, the signal caller, Jed Drenning. Jed, who's going to light it up through the air on this week one in the Big 12?
This is a team effort. So when we pick passing yards, it's passing yards by team, rushing yards, et cetera, et cetera. Who won last year? I just know it wasn't me. Who ended up winning? Was it you?
I think it was Wes.
I just know it wasn't me.
It was. I think it was either Wes or me.
I think I jumped out to a huge lead, and then Skylar made it close down the stretch, but I think I barely held on, if I'm remembering correctly.
That's how sad it was. We kept getting all these zeros, and that guy's was in a 10-team, a 14-team last year. We did it 10 teams year before. 14-team Big 12. Now it's a 16-team Big 12. So I'm not to award points for last year. It was like the top 5. I guess I'll stick to that. I don't want to go 10 deep on these things. So, okay, week 1. Everybody's pretty much playing full slate of actions. There's 16 possibilities, really. I'm going to pick as the team to throw for the most yards in the Big 12, week 1. I'm going to go with Colorado. I've got my logic. We'll see if it works. Ooh. They're playing North Dakota State. Now, that's not because North Dakota State can't defend the pass. That's just because by virtue, when you look at a lot of games here, I think a lot of these games will be over by halftime. I'm not sure that Colorado game will. I think Colorado might have too much skill, but this is a bad matchup for Colorado. Their skill might overwhelm North Dakota State. They might. They've got potentially the first-round pick, number 1 overall pick in the NFL draft, and Shadur Sanders, Travis Hunter. They have toys at wideout, all kind of skill guys. But North Dakota State is just rugged and tough, and they do all the little things well. But I think it's going to be a game long enough that Colorado might have to keep throwing it to rack up some yards, and that's why I'm going with Colorado to throw for the most yards in week 1 in Big 12 action. Again, not a slight against North Dakota State. I wouldn't be surprised if they might make things interesting and even find a way to shock the world. Now their coach Tim Polasek has called Shadur Sanders. He's saying all the right things. Look, he's calling him the best player the Bison have seen yet. So we'll see.
Bison versus Buffalo. I like that.
Bison versus Buffalo. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's sound logic, Jed. The rest of these games are going to be over at halftime. Teams aren't going to be throwing the ball like that, but Colorado's going to be in a dogfight. I'm picking up what you're putting down there. I think
Penn State's just a different
sound
game,
logic. I do.
Right?
Right. Yeah. No, I like I said, I'm picking up what your logic there. I think is on point. Another thank you to our friends at Johnston Equipment for presenting this episode. of ITG.
I interrupted your Johnson read. I apologize. Which means they'll throw for the fewest. But...
Location on Route 33. Big O, you still there? You still got us?
I'm still here.
We still have Big O, or have we lost? Okay, Big O, big dog, your runaway beer truck offense / player, all encompassing there. Who's going to run for the most yards in the Big 12 this week?
I'm going to say what I had pulled up here. I had Kansas State.
Okay.
Against the Linwood Lions.
Tennessee Martin. Or wait, are you talking Kansas or Kansas State? Kansas is against Lindenwood.
You
get what I'm saying? Kansas State is Tennessee Martin.
Is that right?
Yeah, Kansas State's Tennessee.
Right, August 29th.
Yeah, Kansas State is Tennessee Martin.
Golly, dude.
Okay, so you're going with Kansas. You're going with the Jayhawks.
Going with the Jayhawks, dog.
No, you're good. You're just going with Kansas, not Kansas State. The Jayhawks. Yeah. We got you.
It's Lindenwood's mascot.
I'm going with the Jayhawks against the old Linwood Lions. All right.
Are they Lions?
The Lions. They are the Lindenwood Lions. They're out of the Big South. All right. So Owen's on the board with Kansas. Up against Lindenwood. Skylar, offense of the week. Who's scoring the most points?
Wes. It's just big rushers, so it's all encompassed on the rushing part. So my job's a little bit easier now.
The level of hate he had for Devin Neal last year.
It's a little bit easier.
He had a love-hate relationship with Devin Neal last year.
I was gonna say Devin Neal's still there. Owen's been riding Devin Neal for a couple years now. This guy's got to graduate, man.
That's been my guy, dude. It's a love-hate. It's been a love-hate.
I love it. Hopefully, it's more love for you this week, Big O. All right, Skylar, offense of the week. Some interesting options here. Where are you going?
Yeah, there is. I thought about it long and hard, and I went back and forth on a couple of them. And after hearing Jed speak, I think I'm going to go with kind of a similar thing here. And I think it's going to be a game that's going to go all the way deep into the fourth quarter. So I'm going with West Virginia. No, I'm just kidding. Nah, just kidding. But I'm with O on this. I saw they're playing Lindenwood, and I thought that was a middle school that I played back in the day. So just based on that alone, I think the Jayhawks are going to put up a big 70 burger on whatever they're called, the Lindenwood Lions. Yeah, it's going to be a blow.
This Lindenwood hate on here. Come on, man.
Yeah, well, good thing for my defense. My defense of the week. I'm going with Linwood. No, I'm sorry, Lindenwood, but I'm not. I'm kidding. No, my defense of the week. I'm going to go with Texas Tech. They're at home Saturday night in prime time against Abilene Christian. Poor little Abilene Christian. Those tortillas are going to be flying, and they're not going to know what to do with themselves. I think Texas Tech will hold single digits, maybe 10 points at the most. So give me Texas Tech for my Big 12 defense of the week.
Hey,
that will wrap it up for our week 1 pick'em. Oh boy.
I think we need to close with what you're at liberty to tell us about your plans for the rest of the week. Are you able to discuss that?
What was that?
Are you able to discuss what your plans might be for the rest of the week?
He just dropped out of the chat. He's no longer here.
Yeah, I guess that's a no.
Maybe not.
Maybe not. I guess that's a no.
That answers that
How
question.
about this, Jed? Because you know what's funny? I thought about teeing him up there too, but I didn't know what Owen wants to say or what Owen doesn't want to say.
Fun things are coming.
To speak for him, and since we just lost him, you just make
Leave
sure you're
it at
watching
that.
the Pat McAfee show live from Morgantown Friday afternoon. Okay, noon to 2 on ESPN2, live from the campus of WVU in the hills of West Virginia, nestled into Morgantown. Just make sure you're watching the McAfee show on Friday. That's all we'll say for Big O. For the beer truck, Big Owen Schmidt. For the producer / co-host / Mr. Do-It-All, Skylar Callahan. And for the signal caller, Jed Drenning, I'm Wes Euler. The one thing we ask of you is to be an ear and tell an ear about your new favorite WVU football podcast. Take care, everybody. Enjoy the Labor Day weekend. Stay safe if you're out there traveling around. Make some noise. Get there early and make some noise if you're going to the game on Saturday.
And on Friday. Phil Steele on Friday.
Phil Steele is back in the mix. So we will have Jed and Skylar will have another great conversation with Phil Steele as we roll into our regular season programming here on ITG. But that'll do it for the PSU preview. Let's go beat these Nittany Lions. Let's go make it a Labor Day weekend to remember. Take care, everybody, and we'll talk to you soon. You've been in the gun.
ITG.
The fun doesn't have to stop here.
Be sure to hit subscribe and never miss an episode.
If you have any questions, suggestions, or feedback,
be sure to follow us on X at In the Gun Podcast.
Join us again next time.
Until then,
tell an ear to tell an ear about your new favorite WVU football podcast.
This mission is over. It's over.